Some Christian apologists, like William Lane Craig, have made a claim that the Gospels represent multiple independent attestation of the events about Jesus' life. The idea behind it is that because the four Gospels are independent, then this increases the historical reliability of the events having actually taken place. Let's take a look at William Lane Craig making this claim.
Historians have established this fact on the basis of evidence such as the following. 1. Jesus' burial is multiply attested in early independent sources. We have 4 biographies of Jesus by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which have been collected into the New Testament, along with various letters of the Apostle Paul.
So in this video, we are going to analyze this claim. We are going to start by looking at what scholars have said about this. Then we are going to take a look at something called the synoptic problem. And finally, we are going to respond to the claim that the sources that the Gospels use, for example, L for Luke or M for Matthew, that these sources were independent from each other. So let's get to it. First, let's take a look at some things that scholars have said about this. This is something from Jan van Sieber in his book about oral tradition in history. He says, "We cannot assume that the testimony of 2 different informants from the same community or even society is really independent. This is very important. In history, proof is given only when 2 independent sources confirm the same event or situation. But it is not possible to do this with oral tradition, wherever a corpus exists and information flows are unstemmed. And this is most cases. Feedback and contamination is the norm. No one will consider the 3 synoptic gospels as independent sources, even though they have different authors. They stem from one single oral milieu, from one corpus in one community." So basically he's making the point that all of the gospels go back to the same community of oral tradition within the same community. So they don't really count as being independent from each other or as providing independent attestation. Now let's take a look at something Ehrman says in one of his blog posts. He says, "Technically, the term independent sources refers to sources that have not used one another for their accounts. However, even though these sources may be independent of one another, it is possible that the sources on which they were built, whether oral or written, may not have been independent of one another. It may be that there were independent lines of tradition that stem ultimately from a single source." So again, we see Ehrman saying the same thing. These different accounts ultimately go back to the same oral tradition, so they are not really independent. Now let's take a look at something called the synoptic problem. In a few words, the synoptic problem is basically the fact that a lot of material appears word for word both in Mark and also in Matthew and Luke. And what scholars says about this is that this obviously shows that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source and then redacted the account on Mark. Let's take a look at a short video on this.
They include the same parables and miracle stories, usually in the same sequence. They frequently contain exactly the same Greek wording with only minor changes. And this identical wording occurs not only in dialogue by the characters, but also in statements made by the narrator to the reader. By one estimate, 97% of the Greek text of Mark is contained in Matthew, and 88% of it is contained in Luke. These similarities are far too pervasive to be explained merely by coincidence, oral tradition, or common subject matter.
Now, one thing that people sometimes respond to this is that one will expect this kind of thing from people reporting on the same event, and that this is compatible with witnesses reporting on the same event. Let's take a look at a Christian apologist making this point.
As a police officer, because I happen to be a police officer. So I'm just saying, if I was to take a crime that occurred last week, and it was a 20-minute thing, and so you each write 10 pages on what happened, there will be places where they agree word for word. I don't think that necessarily, one of two things happen. They either made it up together, those pieces word for word, but they're sprinkled along the way with differences, but some things are similar. I'm also could be that they just happen to hear those things accurately, and they represented them accurately.
However, this is not true. The witnesses are not going to agree literally on the exact same words when even if they describe the same event. Let's take a look at scholar Mark Kudakri responding to this exact claim.
Now, sometimes people say, well, surely if you've got different people writing about the same events, you'll expect lots of similarities as well as the differences. Look at 3 different police reports of the same incident and so on. That doesn't wash because you've got verbatim identity, the kind of thing you only get with literary copying. And just to be clear, if you had 2 students that produced work that was as similar as Matthew is to Mark, Mark is to Luke, Matthew is to Luke, you would actually call them out for plagiarism. That's how close these agreements are.
Bart Ehrman also had some words to say about this. He has a good analogy. Imagine that 2 people are in a debate, and many years later, they ask you, okay, how was the debate? Now, what are the odds that the 2 people are going to have massive paragraphs of word for word matching what the other person said? Okay, they are like minuscule. Let's take a look.
So, Jonathan, let me tell you what this would be like. Suppose both Stephen and I, when we're done in a few years, write down our experiences of today. How likely is it we're going to have paragraphs after paragraph that are verbatim, word for word the same to describe what we just experienced? How likely is that?
Yeah, it's probably...
It is humanly not possible. It will not happen.
Now, at last, there is also another claim being made there. Some apologists say sometimes that even if Matthew, Luke were not independent from Mark, that they say that at least the sources they were based on, like M or L, these are hypothetical sources. They say that these were independent from each other. So they kind of count, so we can say that we have multiple independent sources. Now, let's take a look at William Lane Craig making this argument.
Luke and Matthew also had special sources that don't come from Mark, and these are typically arbitrarily labeled M for Matthew's unique sources and L for Luke's unique sources that do not come from either Matthew or Mark. And then, of course, you've got John as well, which seems to have independent sources. So when we talk about, for example, 5 independent sources for the story of Jesus' burial or the empty tomb narrative, it's these sources that the New Testament authors themselves employ.
Now, let's take a look at a video by Richard Carrier where he responds to that.
That's totally made up. Like there's literally zero evidence for any of this. And he does, like I said, the argument I mentioned earlier that he gives is completely fallacious. It's not an argument that would be given in any other field of history. You don't just say that, well, we don't have a source for this, therefore they did. That's not necessarily how, I mean, you need to argue for that. You need evidence for that. And especially when we know these are authors who are making stuff up. We know they're very fond of making things up. All the Gospels. There are some 40 Gospels that we know about, super fond of making things up. Look at the infancy Gospels, made up. Look at the Proto-Evangelion of James, made up. So they love making things up. So the question is maybe they have sources, but how do you know? You need evidence for this assertion. You can't just say, oh, whatever in Luke isn't in Mark or Matthew comes from L. It's a source. And not only does Luke have that source, Ehrman says we have that source. That's bullshit. No historian acts like this in any other field. No, we do not have that source. We don't even know if there is such a source. It is hypothesis. It is pure hypothesis. And it's a hypothesis for which there is no evidence. Like there's none. Like none at all. So
basically, Carrier's answer is that there is no real evidence of that these sources really even existed. This is just hypothetical. And I will add that even if we did have evidence that these hypothetical sources existed, right? You still don't know if they are independent from one another. We don't know if L was truly independent from M, or if they go back to the same pool of oral tradition that was circulated in the original same community, right? So you will also have to prove that. So all in all, I don't think the claim that the Gospels are independent has a lot of force, right? This is, in my opinion, a very weak argument. So anyway, thank you for watching. Please give a like and subscribe to the channel. Please support me on Patreon, and see you next time. Bye.